Imagine a town where the ground doesn't just hold the dead, it remembers them. 27 years ago, 7 children made a pact in blood, a promise to return if the nightmare ever woke up. Well, the clock has struck, the silver suit is shimmering in the dark, and the sewers of Derry are hungry again. Are you brave enough to honor the oath? Before we descend, hit that like button, subscribe to join our circle, and comment your city of origin below to let us know you've arrived for the reunion. The rain in Derry did not just fall, it wept. It was October 1957, and the sky had turned a bruised shade of purple, pouring a deluge that threatened to swallow the small main town whole. On Witcham Street, the gutters were transformed into raging rivers, carrying the debris of a dying autumn toward the gaping, hungry mouths of the storm drains. Inside the Denbrough house, the atmosphere was thick with a different kind of heaviness. Bill Denbrough, 14 and pale, sat propped up in bed, his breath hitching in a rhythmic stutter that he couldn't shake. He was battling a fever, but his hands were busy. He was folding a sheet of newspaper with the precision of a surgeon, his fingers slick with the paraffin wax he used to waterproof the small craft. "Will it really float, Big Bill?" Georgie asked, his eyes wide with a kind of pure, unadulterated adoration that only a younger brother could possess. At 7 years old, Georgie was a burst of sunshine in a house that had grown increasingly quiet, increasingly shadowed. Bill looked at his brother, a pang of unexplained dread tightening in his chest, a classic soap opera premonition that something in the fabric of their lives was about to tear. "It'll float, Georgie. It'll float faster than a RR racehorse." He handed the boat, the SS Georgie, to the boy. Their fingers brushed for a second, a lingering moment of connection that felt like a goodbye they didn't know they were saying. "Go on then," Bill whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of sickness and a strange protective urge. "But be careful. The gutters are mean today." Georgie, clad in his iconic bright yellow slicker, a solitary spark of color against the gray world, grinned and ran out into the storm. He didn't see the way the shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch after him, or how his mother's piano music in the parlor suddenly hit a discordant, mournful chord. Outside, the world was a sensory overload. The rain lashed against Georgie's hood as he chased the SS Georgie down the sidewalk. The boat danced beautifully, bobbing over the white caps of the gutter stream. Georgie laughed, a sound of pure joy that Derry rarely heard. But then, the current surged. With a sickening lurch, the paper boat veered toward the corner of Witcham and Jackson, sucked toward a storm drain with a violent, gurgling roar. "No!" Georgie cried, dropping to his knees. He reached into the darkness of the drain, his small hand hovering over the abyss. Then, the darkness peered back. 2 eyes, glowing with a disturbing amber light, materialized from the shadows of the pipe. Georgie froze. He expected a monster, but what he saw was a clown. He looked like a cross between Bozo and a storybook character, with a face painted a stark, chalky white and a smile that was far too wide to be human. "Hiya, Georgie," the clown chirped. His voice was like a melody played on a broken music box, sweet, hypnotic, yet laced with a rhythmic, pulsing danger. It was a voice of tempting ambiguity, promising wonders while hiding a jagged edge. I shouldn't talk to strangers," Georgie stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "And you're wise to be cautious, Georgie. Very wise." The clown tilted his head, his silver suit shimmering in the dim light. "I'm Pennywise the dancing clown. And you're Georgie. Now we aren't strangers, are we?" The clown held up the SS Georgie. "Do you want your boat back, Georgie? It's a fine boat. Bill did a wonderful job. It smells like the circus down here, Georgie. Can you smell it? Peanuts, cotton candy, and balloons." Georgie leaned closer, drawn in by the strange magnetic pull of the entity. The rain seemed to fade into the background, leaving only him and the clown in a spotlight of predatory intimacy. "Do they float?" Georgie whispered. The clown's smile stretched even further, revealing rows of teeth that were suddenly too sharp, too many. "Oh yes," Pennywise hissed, his voice dropping to a gravelly, carnal register. "They float. And when you're down here with me, you'll float too." As Georgie reached out his hand, the air in Derry grew still. The adults in the nearby houses looked out their windows and saw nothing, their eyes clouded by a town-wide apathy that ignored the screams of children. With a lightning-fast movement, the clown's arm shot out, not like a man's, but like a claw. The scream that followed was cut short by the sound of tearing fabric and the wet crunch of bone. The SS Georgie continued its journey, disappearing into the dark, while the yellow slicker lay discarded in the red-stained mud. Derry remained quiet. The storm continued. And in the Denbrough house, the piano music finally stopped. The silence in the Denbrough household following Georgie's disappearance was louder than any thunderclap. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that draped over the furniture and settled into the marrow of Bill Denbrough's bones. His parents had become ghosts while still drawing breath, his mother lost in the hypnotic, repetitive keys of her piano, and his father buried behind a wall of newspapers and gin. In true dramatic fashion, the tragedy hadn't broken the family, it had simply erased the color from their world, leaving Bill to navigate a monochromatic nightmare alone. Months passed. The spring of 1958 arrived in Derry with a deceptive bloom, but the shadows in the corners of the town seemed to grow longer, sharper, and more sentient. The town's collective amnesia was the cruelest part of the soap opera that was Derry life. Everyone knew children were vanishing, yet everyone looked at their watches and discussed the weather. The hauntings began not with a bang, but with a whisper of personal trauma. Ben Hanscom, the shy, overweight boy who spent his days seeking refuge in the Derry Public Library, was the first to realize that the town's history was written in blood. One afternoon, as the golden sun slanted through the library windows, Ben found himself in the basement stacks. The air grew inexplicably cold, the kind of cold that feels like a hand resting on your heart. A red balloon drifted lazily from behind a shelf. It bobbed with a rhythmic, almost teasing grace. Ben's breath hitched. From the darkness emerged a figure, not a clown this time, but a headless soldier from the 1906 Kitchener Ironworks explosion, a tragedy Ben had just been reading about. The entity didn't just scare him, it invited him into its agony. "Want an egg, Ben?" a voice rasped, a sound like dry leaves skittering on a grave. The ambiguity of the horror lay in how the monster seemed to know Ben's loneliness, offering a terrifying companionship in exchange for his soul. Ben fled, his heart hammering a rhythm of pure, unadulterated dread. Across town, Eddie Kasbrak was dealing with a different kind of monster, his mother's love. Sonia Kasbrak was the quintessential soap opera matriarch, suffocating, manipulative, and convinced the world was a giant petri dish designed to kill her son. She checked his breathing as if it were a ticking bomb. Walking past the dilapidated porch of 29, Neibolt Street, Eddie felt the mean air of the place. From beneath the porch, a creature crawled out. It was a leper, its skin sloughing off in wet, grey ribbons. But it wasn't just a monster, it was the embodiment of every sickness Eddie's mother had ever whispered into his ear. The leper didn't just chase him, it moved with a sickening rhythmic sensuality, a tempting ambiguity of decay that suggested that beneath the rot lay a dark, eternal rest. "I'll cure you, Eddie," it hissed, reaching out with fingers that looked like scorched twigs. Eddie's asthma attack was so violent he nearly blacked out, barely escaping the clutches of a fear that felt as intimate as a family secret. But the most visceral haunting belonged to Beverly Marsh. In her small, cramped apartment, the tension was always high. Her father, Alvin Marsh, watched her with eyes that lingered too long, a gaze filled with a complex, terrifying worry that bordered on something far more sinister. It was a domestic drama of the highest stakes. One evening, while Beverly stood at the bathroom sink, a sound began to emanate from the drain, a wet, sucking glug-glug that sounded like a heart beating in a pool of mud. "Help me, Beverly," a chorus of children's voices whispered from the pipes. "We all float down here." Suddenly, with the force of a geyser, a fountain of thick, hot, crimson blood erupted from the sink. It splashed against the mirror, soaked her hair, and coated the walls in a rhythmic pulse of gore. Beverly screamed, a sound of absolute violation. But when her father burst into the room, his eyes remained clear. "What is it, Bev-Vi? What's wrong?" he asked, standing amidst the carnage. Beverly looked at the blood, it was everywhere, dripping from the ceiling, pooling at her feet, and then at her father, who saw only a clean white sink. The horror was hers alone. The ambiguity of the scene was agonizing. The blood represented her stolen innocence, her fear of growing up in a house where the predator sat at the dinner table, yet the world told her she was crazy. By the time summer arrived, these isolated incidents began to weave together. Each child realized their visions weren't just hallucinations, they were being hunted by something that knew their darkest secrets. They were characters in a play they hadn't auditioned for, and the director was a badut with amber eyes who was just getting started. The pattern was set. The fear was weaponized. And in the shadows of Derry, Pennywise watched his actors with a hungry, expectant grin, waiting for the moment they would finally find each other. The Barrens was a jagged scar of greenery and swamp in the middle of Derry's paved indifference. It was a place where the rules of the sane adult world, the world that ignored missing children and turned a deaf ear to screams, did not apply. In the heat of July 1958, the air in the Barrens hung heavy and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth, stagnant water, and an unspoken electric tension that crackled between 7 souls who had been marked by destiny. It began with a shared silence that was more profound than any conversation. Bill Denbrough, his stutter a constant rhythmic reminder of his internal fracture, stood by the stream. Beside him was Eddie Casbrack, clutching his inhaler like a holy relic, and Ben Hanscom, whose shirt was still stained with the dirt from his latest escape from Henry Bowers. They were the original architects of this sanctuary, but the cast was about to grow in a way that felt like the climax of a grand, tragic drama. One by one, they trickled in, drawn by a magnetic pull they couldn't explain. Beverly Marsh arrived with her hair glowing like a fire in the sun, her eyes carrying the weight of the blood no one else could see. Richie Tozier, the boy with the thick glasses and the endless stream of voices designed to mask his terror. Stan Uris, the logical boy whose mind was a neat grid currently being torn apart by the irrational. And finally, Mike Hanlon, fleeing the literal and figurative fire of Derry's racial hatred. The catalyst for their union was a moment of visceral cinematic violence, the apocalyptic rock fight. Henry Bowers and his gang of thugs had cornered them, their faces twisted with a cruelty that felt ancient, as if the town itself were breathing through them. But as the rocks flew, something shifted. The 7 outcasts didn't just fight back, they moved as a single organism. There was a tempting ambiguity in their unity, a sense that they were no longer just children, but pieces of a cosmic puzzle finally clicking into place. When Henry retreated, bloody and screaming promises of revenge, the 7 stood alone in the clearing, panting, their hearts beating in a synchronized, thumping rhythm. He's not just a bully, Mike whispered, wiping blood from his forehead. There's something in him. Something that wants us dead. Bill stepped forward, his eyes burning with a cold, desperate fire. It's not just Henry. It's the CC clown. I saw him. In Georgie's room. In the PHPH photo album. The PP picture, it moved. The dam broke. The secret that had been rotting inside each of them spilled out like a confession in a dimly lit cathedral. Eddie spoke of the leper, Ben of the mummy in the library, Beverly of the blood that only her ears could hear. Richie admitted to seeing a Paul Bunyan statue come to life, and Stan whispered about the bird-like creature that had tried to pull him into a nightmare of logic-defying geometry. It's the same one, Ben said, his voice trembling but certain. He pulled a stack of library records and old newspaper clippings from his bag. I've been looking. Derry isn't like other towns. The murder rate, the accidents, they're 6 times the national average. And it happens in cycles. 1906, the Ironworks explosion. 1929, the Bradley Gang shootout. And now, 1957. Every 27 years, Derry wakes up to eat. The revelation hung in the air, a dark cloud blocking the summer sun. They realized they weren't just victims of a monster, they were the antibodies of a dying city. The entity they called it was woven into the very fabric of Derry's history, a predatory force that had shaped the town's apathy to ensure its own survival. We're the only ones who can see it, Bill said, looking at each of them. His voice had lost its stutter for a fleeting, powerful second. Because we're LL losers. The kids no one cares about. The ones who are already broken. Richie, for once, didn't make a joke. He looked at the circle of bruised and battered faces, the fat boy, the stutterer, the girl with the bad reputation, the sickly kid, the Jew, the black boy, and the loudmouth. He felt a surge of love so intense it was almost painful, an intimacy that transcended their ages. The losers, Richie whispered, a wry, tragic smile touching his lips. That's us. The Losers Club. They stood in a circle, their hands hovering near one another, not yet touching but connected by an invisible thread of shared trauma and budding hope. The ambiguity of their situation was terrifying. They were 7 children against an ancient, nameless evil, but for the first time since Georgie's death, Bill felt a spark of something other than grief. They weren't just friends, they were a fortress. And as the sun began to set over the barrens, casting long, spindly shadows through the trees, they made a silent pact. They would not be the next victims. They would be the hunters. Deep in the sewers, beneath the very ground they stood on, a rhythmic, dry chuckle echoed through the pipes. Pennywise was listening. He smelled their fear, but he also smelled something new, something he hadn't tasted in eons: defiance. The game had changed, and the first act of the Derry tragedy was reaching its boiling point. The transition from the sun-drenched barrens to the throat of Derry's sewer system was like crossing a border into a different, more malevolent dimension. It was August now, and the heat was oppressive, but as the Losers Club stood before the massive rusted concrete cylinder that led into the darkness, the air coming from within was unnervingly cold. It smelled of wet stone, ancient rot, and something sickly sweet, like a funeral home trying to mask the scent of death with cheap perfume. This was the soap opera climax of their childhood. They weren't just 7 kids playing in the woods anymore, they were a fellowship of the broken, standing at the edge of the abyss. Bill Denbrough stood at the front, his knuckles white as he gripped his flashlight. Behind him, the group was a tableau of high-stakes tension. Beverly looked at Bill with a gaze that was far too mature for her years, a silent promise of loyalty that made Ben's heart ache and Richie's jokes die in his throat. "We don't have to go in," Bill said, his voice echoing against the concrete. "I can go alone." "Don't be a martyr, Big Bill," Richie snapped, though his hands were shaking so hard he had to tuck them into his pockets. "If we're going to die in a pile of sh*T, we're doing it together. That's the loser way." They stepped inside. The darkness didn't just surround them, it seemed to reach for them, a tempting ambiguity in the way the shadows flickered against the damp walls. It was as if the sewers were an extension of the entity itself, a cold, wet womb that had birthed every tragedy Derry had ever known. The water at their feet was black and thick, swirling around their ankles like invisible hands trying to pull them deeper. As they waded further into the labyrinth, the reality of the surface world began to dissolve. Time felt fluid, distorted. The rhythmic drip of the pipes sounded like a countdown. Suddenly, the tunnel widened into a vaulted chamber, and the flashlights caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, a trail of colorful discarded toys, half buried in the silt. A single, red balloon floated against the ceiling, bobbing in a draft that shouldn't have existed. "Look," Eddie whispered, his voice hitching as he struggled to breathe. "The toys, they're all here." Then, the laughter started. It wasn't the manic giggle of a circus clown, it was a deep resonating sound that vibrated in their very marrow. From the darkness of a side pipe, Pennywise emerged. He didn't run, he glided, his silver suit shimmering with a light that seemed to come from nowhere. His face was a mask of friendly malevolence, his eyes glowing like dying stars. "You came." Pennywise chirped, his voice dripping with a predatory affection. "The losers. The little heroes of Derry. Have you come to play? Have you come to float?" The entity began to shift. Before their eyes, the clown's form blurred. For a second he was the leper for Eddie, then he was the headless soldier for Ben, then he was Alvin Marsh for Beverly, his voice turning into a low, terrifying crawl that whispered, "Are you still my little girl, Bevvi?" The psychological weight was nearly unbearable. The group began to fracture, the drama of their individual fears threatening to pull them apart. But Bill stepped forward, his eyes locked on the clown. He remembered the silver slugs Ben had fashioned from silver dollars, the tokens of their shared belief. Why you're not real?" Bill screamed, his voice shattering the hypnotic spell. "You're just a monster. And we're not AFAF afraid." The power of his conviction was a physical force. The children moved closer together, their shoulders touching, creating a circuit of belief that the entity couldn't penetrate. Beverly took the slingshot from her pocket. Her hands were steady, her eyes fierce. There was a dangerous, alluring power in her at that moment, a girl turning into a warrior, her presence commanding the air around her. "For Georgie," she cried, letting the silver slug fly. The projectile struck Pennywise squarely in the forehead. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The mask of the clown cracked. A sound like grinding stones erupted from the entity as its face split open, revealing a glimpse of something orange, blinding and ancient, the deadlights. But the children didn't look away. They leaned into their collective imagination, imagining the silver as a holy fire. Pennywise shrieked, a sound of genuine existential pain. His form flickered like a dying television screen, his limbs elongating into something spindly and insect-like before he recoiled back into the blackness of the deeper tunnels. "It's not over," the voice echoed from the depths, now devoid of its playful lilt. "I will taste your hearts. I will feast on your memories." The silence that followed was heavy. The losers stood in the dark, their flashlights dimming. They had won, but the victory felt hollow. They realized that they hadn't killed it, they had merely wounded a god. The entity was ancient, rooted in the very earth beneath them, and though it had retreated, the connection between them and the monster was now permanent. "He's still there," Stan whispered, his logical mind struggling to process the cosmic horror they had just witnessed. "He's just waiting." They turned back toward the light of the barrens, but as they walked, they felt different. The innocence of their childhood had been burned away in that sewer pipe, replaced by a grim, adult-like resolve. They were no longer just children, they were survivors of a war no one else knew was happening. The golden hour in Derry was usually a time of deceptive peace, but on this late August evening in 1958, the sunset felt like a closing curtain. The air in the barrens was thick with the scent of pine needles and the metallic tang of the stream, but the 7 children standing in a ragged circle felt as if they were presiding over a funeral, the funeral of their own innocence. They had emerged from the sewers physically scarred but alive. Yet, the atmosphere was charged with a heavy soap opera gravity. There were no cheers, only the rhythmic, labored breathing of those who had looked into the mouth of God and found it filled with teeth. Bill Denbrough stood at the center, his face etched with a maturity that looked alien on a boy of 14. He looked at Beverly, whose red hair seemed to catch the last of the dying light, and for a moment, the trauma of the sewers was replaced by a sharp adolescent longing, a tempting ambiguity of a love that was blooming in the wreckage of a nightmare. "It isn't over," Bill said, his voice steady, the stutter nearly gone. "We wounded it. We didn't KK kill it. I can feel it, breathing under us. Like the town is its LL lungs." Ben Hanscom stepped forward, his eyes lingering on Beverly with a quiet, tragic devotion that could fill a dozen scripts. He knew that in the story of their lives, he was the architect of their safety, but perhaps not the hero of her heart. "The cycle," Ben whispered. 27 years. It will sleep, it will heal, and it will wake up hungry. "Then we have to be ready," Mike Hanlon said, his voice grounded and somber. He was the one who felt the roots of Derry most deeply, the one who saw the stains of the past on every sidewalk. Bill reached into his pocket and pulled out a jagged shard of glass, a remnant of a broken bottle they had used earlier. The tension in the circle spiked. This was the moment of the blood oath, a scene of high drama that would define the rest of their lives. "I, Bill Denbrough, swear," he began, his voice dropping to a low melodic register. He pressed the glass into his palm, a sharp flinch crossing his face as the crimson line appeared. "If it ever comes BB back, if it RR returns to Derry, we come back too. All of us." One by one, they stepped into the center. Beverly took the glass next, her eyes locked on Bill's. There was a spark of something electric and dangerous between them as she sliced her hand without blinking. Then came Richie, his usual jokes buried under a mask of grim resolve, Eddie, trembling but defiant, Stan, whose logical mind fought the ritual but whose heart demanded it, Ben, whose touch was gentle even in pain, and Mike, the final seal. They joined hands in a circle, palm to bleeding palm. The tempting ambiguity of the moment was visceral. It was a bond of love, yes, but it was also a curse. As their blood mingled, a rhythmic thrumming seemed to vibrate through the earth, a psychic shockwave that bound their souls to the entity beneath them. For a fleeting second, they weren't 7 individuals. They were a single entity of light standing against the dark. "Swear it," Bill commanded. "Swear it," they echoed, the words rising like a prayer into the darkening sky. Then the soap opera of time began its cruel edit. The weeks turned into months, and the months into years. One by one, the losers began to leave Derry, driven by a subconscious urge to escape the gravity of the black spot on the map. And as they crossed the town limits, something supernatural and terrifying began to happen. They forgot. It was a slow, rhythmic erosion of the soul. Bill moved to London, becoming a master of macabre fiction, his novels filled with imaginary monsters that bore a striking resemblance to a certain clown, yet he couldn't remember his own brother's face. Beverly fled to Chicago, finding success in fashion but falling into the arms of a man who looked and acted exactly like her father, a tragic cyclical ambiguity of trauma she couldn't name because she had forgotten the blood on her bathroom walls. Richie became a famous comedian in Los Angeles, his voice as a shield against a silence he didn't understand. Eddie stayed in New York, running a limousine service and marrying a woman who was a mirror image of his suffocating mother. Ben transformed his body and his life, becoming a world-renowned architect in Nebraska, building beautiful structures to fill the hollow ache in his chest. Only Stan remained in a quiet suburb, haunted by a persistent nagging dread that manifested as a perfectionist's obsession with order. They were successful, wealthy, and seemingly happy, but they were hollow men and women. Their memories of 1958 were buried under layers of psychological concrete. They had traded their trauma for a normal life, but the blood oath remained like a dormant virus in their veins. Only one remained. Mike Hanlon stayed in Derry, becoming the town librarian, the lighthouse keeper of the abyss. He watched the years crawl by, his hair graying prematurely as he sat in the silence of the library, surrounded by the records of Derry's blood-soaked history. He was the only one who remembered. He was the only one who felt the rhythmic pulse of the earth beginning to quicken as the 27th year approached. He sat by the phone, his hand trembling, waiting for the first scream that would signal the end of their peace. The tempting ambiguity of their survival was over. The cycle was turning. The year was 1985, and Derry had grown fat and complacent on its own secrets. The town looked modern on the surface, new storefronts, shinier cars, and the neon glow of the 80s, but the soil remained the same, ancient, sour, and hungry. For 27 years, the beast beneath the streets had slumbered, healing the wounds inflicted by 7 children who had dared to believe in silver and friendship. Now, the rhythmic ticking of the cosmic clock had reached its strike. The silence broke on a humid night in July. It wasn't a child this time, but the death was no less symbolic of Derry's rot. A young man was thrown from a bridge after a festival, and as he drifted toward the muddy banks, a figure in a silver suit with orange pom-poms reached out from the shadows of the girders. The cycle had officially resumed. Mike Hanlon sat in the dim light of the Derry Public Library, the news report on the radio chilling his blood. He didn't need to see the body to know. He felt a phantom itch in the center of his palm, the scar from the blood oath of 1958. For nearly 3 decades, Mike had lived as a monk of the macabre, the only loser who stayed to keep watch. He was the lighthouse keeper of a nightmare, and the light was finally failing. With a hand that shook with a rhythmic, palsied tremor, Mike reached for his address book. It was time for the soap opera to convene its final act. The first call went to London. Bill Denbrough was at the height of his career, a world-famous author of horror who lived in a sprawling estate with his beautiful actress wife Audra. He was wealthy, successful, and utterly hollow. When the phone rang in the middle of the night, Bill felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. "Hello?" Bill said. "Bill? It's Mike Hanlon." The name hit Bill like a physical blow. For 27 years, the word Derry had been a blank spot in his mind, a fog-covered island. But as Mike spoke, the fog didn't just lift, it burned away. Bill felt his tongue thicken. The tempting ambiguity of his successful life vanished, replaced by a visceral, terrifying clarity. Mike. Bill stammered. The stutter, the ghost of his childhood, had returned in a single heartbeat. Is it BB back? It's back, Bill. You made a promise. Across the world, the same scene played out like a series of dramatic vignettes. In Chicago, Beverly Marsh stood in her designer kitchen, her husband Tom watching her with a possessive, simmering rage that mirrored her father's. When Mike called, Beverly didn't cry. She felt a cold, sharp resolve. She looked at the bruises on her arms, the latest gifts from her husband, and realized she had been living a rehearsal for a confrontation she had forgotten. She didn't pack a bag, she simply walked out the door, leaving her old life behind like a shed skin. In Los Angeles, Richie Tozier nearly crashed his car. In New York, Eddie Kasprak vomited into a porcelain sink, his asthma returning with such violence he nearly turned blue. In Nebraska, Ben Hanscom looked at his reflection, thin, handsome, and lonely, and finally understood why he had never been able to love anyone else. The memory of a girl with red hair and a silver slug hit him with the force of a tidal wave. But the most tragic scene of this reunion took place in a quiet suburban bathroom in Atlanta. Stan Uris, the boy who lived by logic and order, received the call and said very little. He hung up the phone and walked to his wife, Patty. He kissed her with a haunting, tempting ambiguity, a goodbye wrapped in a mask of normalcy. Stan went into the bathroom and turned on the water. As the tub filled, he realized he couldn't do it. He was the one who had always seen the deadlights for what they were, absolute, unblinking madness. He didn't have the strength to be a loser again. With a rhythmic, steady hand, he took a razor and carved a single word into the tile above the tub, IT. Then, he ended his part of the story, choosing the silence of the grave over the scream of the clown. A week later, the remaining 5 arrived in Derry. They met at the Jade of the Orient, a Chinese restaurant that felt like a stage set for their shared trauma. The tension was palpable, a thick, atmospheric dread that seasoned the air. They looked at each other, older, grayer, burdened by the soap opera of their adult lives, but beneath the wrinkles, they saw the children of the barons. "Stan isn't coming," Mike said, his voice heavy. The silence that followed was a character in itself. They grieved for a man they had only just remembered. But Pennywise wasn't done with them. As they sat around the table, the tempting ambiguity of their reunion was shattered. The fortune cookies on the table began to twitch. From within the crisp dough emerged monstrosities, a bird's head with a lidless eye, a cluster of spider legs, a tiny rotting finger. The restaurant staff saw nothing. The other patrons continued eating. But the losers were back in the between. "He's watching us," Richie whispered, his glasses slipping down his nose. "He's been waiting for us to get back together so he can finish the meal." Bill looked around the table, his eyes landing on Beverly, then Ben, then Mike and Eddie. They were broken, they were grieving, and they were terrified. But as their hands found each other across the table, that ancient rhythmic power of the Losers Club began to hum once more. The cycle had resumed. The memories were back. And deep in the dark, wet heart of the Derry sewers, a badut began to laugh. The Derry Public Library at midnight felt less like a building and more like a mausoleum for forgotten gods. The smell of old parchment and floor wax was heavy, but beneath it lingered that same rhythmic metallic scent of the sewers. Outside, a summer storm hammered against the stained glass windows, the lightning casting long, distorted shadows of the bookshelves across the floor, shadows that seemed to twitch with a life of their own. Mike Hanlon stood by the old oak table, his face illuminated by a single flickering lamp. He looked at the 5 survivors, Bill, Beverly, Ben, Richie, and Eddie. They were the losers once more, but the stakes had shifted from childhood survival to a cosmic existential drama. The air was thick with a tempting ambiguity. They were together, yes, but the ghost of Stan Uris sat in the empty chair between them, a silent reminder that the price of this reunion was madness or death. "It isn't a badut, Bill," Mike whispered, his voice trembling with a rhythmic, exhausted cadence. "The badut is just a lure. A brightly colored fly on a hook meant to catch a child's eye. What lives beneath Derry is older than the stars, older than the concept of evil itself." Mike pulled out a series of ancient hand-drawn sketches he had recovered from various indigenous archives and hidden Derry journals. They showed a shimmering orange light, a jagged pulsing glow that seemed to bleed off the page. "The deadlights," Mike said, the word hanging in the air like a curse. "It is a predatory consciousness from a dimension the human mind wasn't built to perceive. It crashed here millions of years ago, waiting for the earth to grow food. It doesn't just eat flesh, Richie. It eats the meaning of things. It eats souls." Bill Denbrough stepped closer, his eyes reflecting the flickering lamp. As he touched the sketches, the library seemed to dissolve. The walls bled away into a void of infinite blackness. This was the soap opera of the universe, a grand, terrifying stage where the losers were the only actors left to stop the curtain from falling. Suddenly, Bill wasn't in the library. He was drifting in the macroverse, a place of tempting ambiguity, where physical laws were suggestions at best. He felt a rhythmic, gargantuan heartbeat thrumming through the void. In the distance, he saw the deadlights, 3 swirling malevolent orbs of orange fire that promised absolute insanity to anyone who dared look directly into them. "I am the eater of worlds," a voice boomed, not in his ears, but in his very atoms. It was the voice of the entity, stripped of its playful Pennywise mask. "And you are nothing but the dust of a dying dream." But in that cold, cosmic ocean, Bill felt something else. A presence. Something ancient, slow, and benevolent. He saw a glimpse of a giant shell, Maturin the turtle, an entity as old as it, representing the force of creation. It was a silent, rhythmic witness to the struggle. Bill realized then that their fight wasn't just a small-town horror story, it was a cosmic balance. The losers were the champions of the light, chosen by a force they could barely comprehend. Back in the library, Bill collapsed into Ben's arms, his breath coming in jagged gasps. "Isis saw it," Bill choked out, his stutter returning with a vengeance. "It's not just a monster. It's a hole in the universe." "How do we kill a hole, Bill?" Richie asked, his voice devoid of its usual snark. He looked at Eddie, who was clutching his inhaler so tightly his knuckles were white. The ambiguity of their mission was paralyzing. They were 5 middle-aged humans tasked with murdering a god. "The ritual of Chud," Mike answered, his eyes burning with a desperate, tragic fire. It's a battle of wills. A psychic duel. We have to enter the deadlights and refuse to blink. We have to be more real than it is. We have to believe in each other harder than it believes in its own hunger. Beverly stepped into the center of the group. She looked at Bill, then at Ben, her eyes shimmering with the complex soap opera emotions of 3 decades of suppressed love and trauma. She realized that Pennywise's greatest weapon wasn't the deadlights, it was their isolation. "We're still the losers," she said, her voice a rhythmic anchor in the storm. "It wants us to feel small. It wants us to feel like adults who have forgotten how to dream. But we remember. We remember the blood, the barons, and the promise." The realization hit them like a physical wave. The clown was terrified of them. It had tried to keep them apart for 27 years because together, their shared belief was a weapon that could pierce the heart of the infinite. "Tonight," Bill said, standing tall, the stutter vanishing as he found his resolve. "We Gigi go back into the dark. We don't go for Georgie, or for Stan. We go for the LL light." As they prepared to leave the library, the building groaned. The books on the shelves began to bleed, and the laughter of a badut echoed through the vents, a mocking rhythmic sound that promised a final bloody confrontation. The cosmic truth was out. They weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for the soul of existence. The final descent into the bowels of Derry felt like a journey into the digestive tract of a god. The air was no longer just air, it was a thick rhythmic soup of ancient spores, the scent of every child's fear since the dawn of time, and the cold, wet stench of the abyss. The Losers Club, now 5, but carrying the ghosts of 2, moved with a synchronized, heavy grace. They were no longer the successful adults they had pretended to be for 27 years. They were the children of the barons again, fueled by a tragic, desperate love that was the only thing capable of surviving this far down. The lair was a vaulted cathedral of bones and discarded memories. High above, suspended in a web that defied the laws of geometry, were the floaters, the victims of Pennywise's long reign, held in a state of eternal, silent suspension. In the center of the chamber, the clown was gone. In its place was a creature that made the mind scream for the mercy of blindness. It was a monstrous, spindly, spider-like being, its body a pulsing mass of black chitin and orange light. "I am eternal," the creature shrieked, its voice a cacophony of 1,000 dying screams. "I am the eater of worlds. I am the end of all you love." The deadlights erupted from its thorax, 3 orbs of blinding rhythmic orange fire that threatened to pull their souls out of their bodies. This was the soap opera of the end times. Bill Denbrough stepped forward, his eyes locked on the light. He felt the vacuum of the macroverse pulling at his mind, but he didn't blink. We're not AFAF afraid." Bill screamed, his voice a rhythmic hammer. "You're just a BB Badut. You're just a SS Spider." The ritual of Chud began. It wasn't a battle of swords, but a battle of wills. Bill and Richie were pulled into a psychic void, their minds interlocking with the entity. They saw the tempting ambiguity of the monster's existence, that it was as much a prisoner of its own hunger as they were of their fear. The monster tried to mock them, showing them visions of their failures, their lost years, and the blood on Stan's bathroom floor. But then, the tide turned. Eddie Kasbrak, the boy who had spent his life afraid of germs, did the unthinkable. Seeing Richie being crushed by a massive hairy limb, Eddie lunged forward. He shoved his aspirator, filled with his belief that it was battery acid, into the creature's gaping maw. "This is for the losers, you son of AB*TCH. Eddie screamed. The effect was visceral. The creature shrieked in genuine agony as its physical form began to dissolve from the inside out. But in its dying thrash, it struck Eddie. The blow was fatal. As Eddie fell, the soap opera reached its peak of tragic intimacy. Richie caught him, his glasses flying off as he sobbed, "Don't you dare, Edis. Don't you dare leave me." I fixed it, didn't I, Wheezy?" Eddie whispered, a final rhythmic smile on his lips before his light went out. The grief was the final catalyst. The remaining losers, Bill, Beverly, Ben, and Mike, surrounded the heart of the beast. They didn't just strike it, they unmade it. They refused to fear it. They looked at the deadlights and saw them for what they were, a dying, lonely fire in a vast universe. Together, they reached into the creature's chest and crushed its cold, pulsing heart. The death of it was not a quiet affair. As the entity perished, the very foundation of Derry began to crumble. The sewers groaned, and the ground above buckled. The black spot on the map was being erased. The survivors scrambled through the collapsing tunnels, the water rising behind them like a purging flood. They emerged into the early morning light of the Barrens, just as the town center of Derry collapsed into a massive sinkhole. The evil was gone. The cycle was broken. Days later, they stood by the stream one last time. The atmosphere was one of bittersweet, tempting ambiguity. Beverly looked at Ben, really seeing him for the first time in 30 years. The soap opera of their lives was finally giving them a happy ending, born from the ashes of a nightmare. They kissed, a slow, rhythmic connection that felt like the first real thing they had ever done. "It's fading again, isn't it?" Mike asked, his voice soft. They all felt it. Now that the monster was dead, the supernatural amnesia was returning. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a curse, it was a gift. They were being allowed to forget the horror so they could finally live. "We won," Bill said, looking at the scarred palms of his hands. "The LL losers won." As they drove away from the ruins of Derry, the memories began to slip away like mist in the sun. Bill looked in his rearview mirror and for a split second, he saw two boys on a bicycle, one with a stutter and one with a yellow slicker, riding into a sunset that would never end. Then, the image vanished. He didn't remember the clown, or the blood, or the spider. But as he looked at the wedding ring on his finger and the friends by his side, he felt a peace that surpassed understanding. Derry was gone. The losers were free. And somewhere, far beyond the stars, a Korokoro smiled.